started here in a few minutes. Let a few folks settle in. Thank you for making it out in this weather. I like to tell our visitors, though, you need to come here for Chowderfest when it's -5 degrees, and there are 90,000 people who come to Saratoga for not even authentic chowder. So I'm saying I appreciate the fact that you all made it in this weather, but believe me, there's worse. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming out for our final keynote address of the first but not last Saratoga Book Festival. I'm Ellen Beal, president and founder of the Saratoga Book Festival, and I cannot begin to tell you how excited I am to see you all here tonight in person to revel in reading and the authors who have made this festival possible. I would like to take a moment, of course, to thank our generous sponsors, our donors, big and small, the various hosting venues around town, the many friends, neighbors, and members of the Saratoga community who have offered us advice and insight, our gem of a bookstore, Northshire Books, the many authors and participants who joined us, and let's not forget the tireless effort of the Saratoga Book Festival board. Folks, board members, please stand up. You deserve my eternal gratitude and everybody else's applause. Thank you very much. Come on, guys. I think the rest of the crew is outside working the tables. Thank you so much. It's been an unbelievably wonderful team of people who put this together. I would also like to repeat for everybody that this is not a one-time only event. We have a date for 2022 chosen specifically because it should be easy to remember, 10/22/22. So hope to see you all here again. Now let's go on to talk about tonight, because we are truly, truly excited to have these two wonderful people here with us. Tonight's final keynoter is no stranger to bestseller lists. Russell Banks grew up in a working class world that has played a major role in shaping his writing. Through a dozen novels and short story collections that have won him Guggenheim and NEA grants and a St. Lawrence Prize for Fiction, Russell has made a life's work of charting the causes and effects of the terrible things normal men can and will do. He writes with an intensely focused empathy and a compassionate sense of humor that help to keep readers, if not his characters, afloat through the misadventures and outright tragedies in his books. A prolific writer of fiction, Russell Banks' titles include The Darling, The Sweet Hereafter, Cloud Splitter, Rule of the Bone, Affliction, Success Stories, Continental Drift, Searching for Survivors, Trailer Park, The Book of Jamaica, The New World, Hamilton Stark, The Reserve, Lost Memory of Skin, and the collection of short stories titled A Permanent Member of the Family. His newest novel is titled Foregone, a searing novel about memory, abandonment, betrayal, and yes, love. Imaginatively structured around the protagonist's secret memories and alternating between the experiences of the characters who are filming his confession, the novel challenges our assumptions and understanding. It's hard to know where that second sheet left, but we'll leave that alone. I know, it's a good place to end, right? It's a wonderful novel, one of my favorites of this past year, so it'll be a real treat to hear him speak about it. Also joining us on the stage is the wonderful Elena Richardson, president of Yaddo. I imagine everyone in this audience understands what Yaddo is and the importance it is to the literary world, and that this happens to be in our small town is a source of never-ending amazement and joy to me. So thank you so much, Elena, for joining us this evening. This evening is presented in a cultural partnership with Yaddo, and I hope very much that we can continue the partnership in the future. So without further ado, let me turn this over to these two wonderful people joining us tonight.
Hi everyone, let me add a a little congratulations to Ellen and all of the board members who are here and everybody who helped. I just think this is a remarkable thing to have pulled off at any time, and to pull it off in the middle of a pandemic is really just superb. So congratulations, Ellen. I also was feeling I'm very grateful that you all came out when we had this sudden deluge coming over, and now as we're spread out, I have to say my main instinct is I wish we could dim the lights and have a whiskey and kind of gather around, and we would do that, but maybe afterwards some of us will do that. But if you don't know, as Ellen mentioned, we'll mainly talk tonight about Foregone. If you haven't read it, just a quick little setup. So one of the important things you should know is that it takes place on April Fool's Day. We begin on April 1st. The central character is Leonard Fife, who has become a darling of the Canadian left. He's a documentary filmmaker. He's described at one point as the Ken Burns of Canada. So he has fled there in the 60s. He has agreed to make a film. He's dying of cancer. He's agreed to have one of his acolytes, a former student, Malcolm, and his wife Diana, make a film about him for public television. They expect it's going to be a sort of reverential expose of the highlights of this storied career. Leo has decided that it's the one chance he might get to confess. At one point, talking about someone else, he says, we'll go from lying to dying. That is one of the things that they then talk about. It's a superb, superb book, and goes very deep, very fast in this compressed way because we're in one day. But it also, not for the first time, Russell, it touches on, in big brush strokes, in a very sort of, in a way superficially, on things about your life. There actually are resonances. You did some of the things as a young man that Leo remembers doing. So there is a kind of meta-fictional sense of it. Were you having fun with that, or were there other reasons that you were revisiting some territory?
Before I answer the question, because it's a good one and a little difficult to answer, so I'd like to postpone it further, maybe for another day or two. But I just want to thank Ellen for inviting me to be here this evening, and thank you, Elena, especially too, for being willing to be up here on this platform with me. And also I want to say I was here this afternoon for Joyce Carolowitz and Robert Boyers, which was wonderful to do, because she's an old friend, and so is Bob to me. But and then Joyce, Bob was as usual very precise and literate and insightful interlocutor, and Joyce was her usual wry and sly and ironic and deep at the same time responder. So it was a lovely afternoon event, and I thank you for it. But it was a very hard act to follow. I'm sorry for that part. But I had time in between now and then to go home to my house here in Saratoga and have my nightly martini and check in on the Red Sox score. They were up 8-0, which made me very happy. Both the martini and the score. So I'm glad now to try to answer a difficult question. Yes, it does borrow, and I guess literally borrow from my own personal history, my own personal experience, for a number of reasons. One is that the novel is generated really by the fact that that I myself had reached my late 70s as the main character of the novel has, and was going through some of the same experiences, in as much as I was trying to take the value of and take the measure of my own memories. I had now so much more of my life behind me than I had in front of me, and it was inescapable, that I would have to do that and go back over my own personal life and began to realize gradually as I did it how, to what degree, and it is such a great degree, that memory is an act of the imagination. And once I kind of understood that and began to grasp the meaning and implications of that, then I thought that there was then, therefore, an exercise for me in writing this book that would force me to confront that in a way that I hadn't before. This is not a book I could have written, I don't think, even 10 years ago. But certainly couldn't have written until I had reached this age.
How long did it take to write?
Well, it took about 2.5 years, 3 years, which is usual for me. I'm not a fast writer, and also I had to rewrite it many times because the structure came late. I didn't understand how I could simultaneously go into past time in detail and in depth, and also sustain the fact that it was an act of the imagination, and make it contemporary in the telling, the moment of telling as well, and try to figure out a way to do that. The device of having it filmed and having it, in a sense, be a film. It is a kind of documentary film. And the parallels between documentary filmmaking and, in some sense, memoiristic writing were very apparent to me once I figured out how to do that and how to create that alternating structure of the moment of remembering and all the conflation of fantasy, dream, guilt, psychological and emotional responses to events in the past with the moment of the sort of existential moment of revealing as much as you could of this was very, very difficult. In fact, it's probably in some ways formally the most difficult book I've ever written, from my point of view.
And was part of that because Leo he himself acknowledges there are big holes in his memory. His wife thinks he's a confabulist. She's convinced of two things, that the drugs he's taking for cancer are causing him to take some of her memories and take them as his own. She also thinks he's an alcoholic, and that the years of heavy drinking have given him wet brain, and that he's not remembering. So structurally, how did that come to be too? That you thought, let's not only make him somebody who is confessing and digging back in, but possibly lying to us also.
Well, he's not consciously lying. I think I entered that mentality through a man I very much loved and admired, my father-in-law, who was suffering from dementia late in his life, and as a result of the dementia was confabulating. And I had never really encountered confabulation before up close. And once I did, I realized how, how real his story was to himself as he talked about his past, even though it was a mingling of memory, of fantasy, of books he had read, of family stories, time that collapsed, and so things that happened yesterday in his memory, in his recounting, in his narrative, had actually, he thought, had happened 50 years ago, and vice versa. Things that had happened 50 or 75 years ago had happened yesterday to him. And I was struck by this for a number of reasons, which I think those of you here who write fiction will recognize. This is very much how it is when you write fiction. This kind of piecing together in a coherent narrative that is all believable. Even the parts you have made up but don't quite know you've made up. And the parts you dreamed, and the parts someone else told you. They all come together in the narrative. And it was that I think led me to think my way into the mentality of Leo Fife at the end of his life, confabulating. Yes, it was induced by illness and induced by medication, and the occasion, which is the filming, the documentary filmmaking of his confession. But when he confesses, what is he confessing, finally? What is he doing? And so what I hoped in the course of the novel is that you gradually lose, you don't lose interest in it, but you lose interest maybe in nailing down what really happened, and you start to worry about and concern yourself, as I did in writing it, with his motivation, with the emotional content of this slightly disassembled context.
Yeah, that was
Does that make
exactly,
sense? I don't
it does. That was exactly how I felt. I thought it does you, I became so taken up with and sort of interested in his psychology and who is Leo Fife that I actually had moments where I thought, he has to get to the end of this before he dies. Like we must get there. But it also reminded me, I was very moved the first time I read you thinking about your mother and the stories she told, which had lies in them, but her lies tended to be about inserting famous people into her narrative. And of course, you've written about your father telling you a lie about your own name, and how that came up. So, and I do love what you've said in the past there about people lying in their storytelling for very specific psychological reasons. So, and Fife does too. So.
Right. Yeah. You're referencing the power of storytelling with my mother, and to a lesser degree the power of fiction with my father. He wasn't much of a storyteller, but he did impose a certain degree of fiction into our lives when I was a boy, and one of them was the fiction about my name. My mother was a storyteller, and they were very different in temperament and presentation of themselves to me as a child and to the world, I guess, at large. The difference I could say is like if I came home from school and at the end of the day I said to my mother, how was your day, Mom? And she'd say, you'll never believe who I saw today at the bus stop. And then she would tell a story. True or not, I don't know, but it was a story. It had beginning, middle, and end. I mean, it was about an encounter with another human being and some drama, etc. If I asked my father, who was somewhat of a depressive, I'd say, how was your day today, Dad? He would say, it was okay. It was like, don't talk to me. That was the end of the story. But he too had his fictions, and he had his own interior narrative of his own life, I'm sure. And he just wasn't a teller. My mother was a teller. Our character in the novel here, Leo Fife, is a teller also, and a storyteller, first as a filmmaker, we gather over time and over the course of the novel, and assembles them into stories. But here at the very end, he's seeking to unravel some of the stories he's told, and he's seeking a kind of redemption. Someone asked me the other day, and I was talking about the book, and she said, do you think that in the end, Leo Fife is redeemed? And I guess by that she meant forgiven, because that's what he's after. And that's
well, and he's trying to say forgive when he says foregone, right?
Right. But we know that's why he's telling this story to his wife who's in the room, to the camera that's in front of him, to the strangers essentially who are in the room also, and to, in some ways, most importantly, the Haitian nurse who's taking care of him. He's trying to tell this story in order to be forgiven, yes, to be redeemed and all. And that is an interesting question. It was for me when she raised it, because I was reminded of it actually this afternoon in the colloquy between Bob Boyers and Joyce Carol Oates when they were talking about empathy for your characters and so on. how do you feel towards them in that regard in history? So my answer to the person who asked the question was saying, well, you know, you're asking a complicated question because you're asking of me, the author, about this character. Do I forgive him? Yes, of course. I would never have written a book if I didn't. I wouldn't have taken this much time of my life and lived with this person. Because he's in many ways, he's an unforgivable man. He does unforgivable things, one would think. So it's a question that's really an interesting one because for me, then I say I have to ask the question of the reader. Does the reader forgive him? Is he redeemed in the eye of the reader? Because that's, after me, yes, now it's yours. And what do you think when you read it? I couldn't answer for you. I can't answer for anybody but myself.
What about the creators we see at work are Malcolm and Diana, who are also very unlikable. Malcolm in particular is a very aggressive, self-centered, you might say cruel man. He's obsessed with his own.
He's parasitical too.
He's parasitical, yeah. But at the end, I don't want to do any spoilers, through various twists and turns, they get what they want, in a sense. So why does Renee, the nurse, why does her act of sabotage not succeed?
Well, I guess you're dealing with like cold reality here. It would have been a romance if she had succeeded in an attempt to sabotage their attempt to appropriate his narrative for their purposes, their careeristic purposes. Instead, she tries, but she fails. But she fails knowing that the power that they have is so much greater than the power she has. These are white, Anglo-Canadians, filmmakers, from her point of view, rich and famous people, and she's a poor Asian nurse taking care of a dying man. And she's, I mean, it would be ahistorical for me to let her do that. But it's enough, I think, that I simply portray in the very end the imbalance of power between this Asian nurse, who is a genuinely good person in the novel, and these kind of cynical and careeristic and parasitical documentary filmmakers on the other hand, white, Anglo-Canadians, and bourgeois, middle-class intellectuals. And the difference between the two is perfectly apparent throughout, but I would be misrepresenting history if I had her overcome them.
Well, this takes us somewhat away from the particular novel, but that imbalance of power is something that's always interested you. And I was thinking, dipping back into your work, as Ellen said, white working class men in particular has been something a group you've observed that you come from, that as a working class girl from Glasgow, I see a lot when I read you on that. But given what we've all been through these past few years, I wondered, in people living in these dispossessed, dying northeastern towns, the level of anger, the level of response, the level of intellectual bourgeois response back to them, you've seen that playing out? So I wondered how you have felt in these particular years watching it reach the it reached.
Yeah, it's been very complicated acceptance and awakening for me in some ways. Starting about 2016, I started being asked by journalists, especially in Europe, but also in the United States, if my characters would have voted for Trump. And I said, yes, sure. Yeah, most of them, but very few of them wouldn't have voted for Trump. I said, that can't be true. We like your characters. In fact, we love them. We know they matter to us. And I said, well, yeah, that's the problem. These are real people that are lovable, and yet they're doing something which is to us reprehensible and incomprehensible. Why is this happening? you can't write fiction, you can't enter into a novel unless what draws you there is a mystery, something that you can't really penetrate in any way except through the writing of the novel. The years or time that it takes you to bend your life to the demands of the form and the demands of the art and the demands of the tradition, all these rigorous demands that you subject yourself to for a period of time. Unless you have a mystery at the heart of it that you can only penetrate through by accepting that and that process. And so this is a mystery to me. I mean, like, why so many members of my own family in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and some of them have now moved to North Carolina and Florida. Why they vote for Donald Trump? Why are they refusing to get vaccinations against COVID? Why is this happening? This is a deep mystery. And for me as a writer, as a novelist, I'm not just a journalist, I'm a novelist, a fiction writer. It's only through the means of that process that I can begin to penetrate. So I have tried to do that often without knowing that's what I was doing, is try to understand the people that I came from, the people who I live among in upstate New York. I live part of the year here in Saratoga, and the other part up in Essex County, in the Adirondacks, which is primarily Trump country, except for the summer people. And many of these people are my friends, and not just neighbors, but friends, and I'm close to them. So this has been until recently it wasn't a conscious investigation or attempt to penetrate that particular mystery, but since about 2016 it has become that for me.
And as part of that, of course, that it's also a book about lies, right? Who's lying, who's telling the truth, which is the other thing that's been sort of resonating through all of our conversations since at least 2016.
Yeah.
So do you working on this when you're talking about finding the form, finding your way through? I was talking to novelist Lauren Groff the other day. She said she always works on 4 things simultaneously. So I was kind of struck by 4 as a very precise number, but also I thought that was incredible. Do you do simultaneous projects?
Rarely, I'm not able to do that really. I need to kind of immerse myself for as long as it seems to take, and then come up for air. And sometimes though, you come up for air after a first draft. When you find you have a draft down, you think you got something done, and the delight, the passion, and the agony and all have all kind of worn off, and you step away, but you haven't finished yet. You haven't finished the work yet. So you step away and take a breath, and that's a good time to work on something else. I've done that, and I do that regularly. With this book, when I managed to have a draft, I stepped away from it and wrote an opera libretto, which took me a long ways away from the depths of writing fiction.
What is the opera?
Well, I wrote it with the composer Robert Carl, who's based in Hartford, Connecticut. It wasn't an adaptation; it was an original story. Should I talk about it?
Please, yeah.
It just premiered actually this summer up at a Siegel Music Colony up here in Screw Lake, and we had a wonderful time. I was delighted by it to see it, as was Robert Carl, the composer. But it's a story. I'll just try to be brief. It's a family story that I stole from my wife, Chase Twitchell. It was her story, really, her family story. Her great-grandfather was Reverend Joseph Twitchell, who was the minister, the congregational minister of the Asylum Hill Congregational Church in Hartford, Connecticut. He was also the lifelong and closest friend of Mark Twain, who lived in Asylum Hill in Hartford, Connecticut, whose estate is still there, of course. And so he was like a family friend who frequently visited the Twitchells in the summer, especially when they went to Keene Valley, New York, up in the Adirondacks, Twitchell's summer home. And so there was this family connection to that. And Joseph Twitchell, Reverend Twitchell, had 9 children. Makes it easy for the librettist because you have a chorus already built in. And his favorite daughter, favorite child, his daughter was named Harmony. Don't you love these old New England names, Harmony? And there was a night in America where the young man who came courting Harmony was asked, who had asked for her hand. Reverend Twitchell was so upset about this, anxious about this, that he asked his great friend Mark Twain to interview the young man to see if he would be fit for the hand of Harmony. The young man was Charles Ives, the great composer. So there was a night in America where the greatest composer of the 20th century was in the same room as the greatest writer of the 19th century. And they were having an interview over the hand of Harmony. And I just thought, this is a great subject. We can make an opera, a Mozartian kind of opera out of these things. 2 acts, take place Midsummer Night's Eve, up at the Adirondacks at the Twitchell summer home. And we got the chorus built in, we got a bass, we got a tenor, we got a soprano, we got a mezzo.
We've got Harmony.
Harmony gets the soprano, she gets the arias. And so Robert and I worked on this thing for a couple of years and had a wonderful time doing it. And it turned out to be rather interesting, exciting, and a great pleasure for me to do.
Well, one of the great pleasures of Foregone for me was that as the story, there's a lot of picaresque elements to it. So Leo tells the story of being on the run with his childhood friend Nick. They think they might go to Cuba, they go to the West Coast, they have many...
But they're going to Australia.
They're going to Australia,
delusion that they can get to Australia.
They have the borrowed, stolen car, they have the... And when they meet up again, many years later, they've been on these sort of parallel lives. So Nick has stayed behind. But one of the things I realized was what a fantastic researcher and historian you are as well, because when they meet up again, it's 1960, Leo has a sort of premonition that Nick is not going to Italy as he thinks he might be doing as someone who signed up, that he's going to Vietnam. As a non-historian and a non-American, I just thought, in 1960, Leo Fife already knows this. So I did a little kind of Googling, and there are reasons he would have known this, but you clearly steep yourself in every detail, every name that you come up with, every historical moment, you've dug into it. So. Well,
I had to. There's always somebody out there who knows the details better than you do, and they put to correct you, and so you try to avoid that interruption in your life. When I published Cloud Splitter, which is the story of John Brown and involves very much his time in North Elba, New York, up near Lake Placid, and all. I had an important scene in the novel where John Brown and his family are headed for North Elba, coming to settle there, and they're passing along Cascade Lake, a road along there, and the image of the lake was very important to me. I don't know if any of you, maybe many of you actually might know Cascade Lake and the road that circles along it. It's a long, narrow, silver lake between the mountains, like a fjord. And it's described as a scimitar, as a sword. And because later in the novel, one of the most dramatic scenes in it, and one of the most controversial events in Brown's life is the butchering of pro-slavers in Kansas with swords, with scimitars that he brought with him. So I was just using the image in order to prefigure some of this in my head. And then the book was published, and then I got first of all, a letter, and then later a phone call, and then a second phone call, and then letters to the editor of the various local newspapers, all from the town historian of Lake Placid, North Elba. And she was absolutely furious with me because I had made a road where there wasn't a road in 1848. In fact, that road had gone around the mountain on the other side, and it couldn't conceivably have happened along Cascade Lake because there was no road there until 1878, 30 years later than I portrayed it. And so I tried to argue with her and say, but this is fiction. This is a story. This is a novel. And I could put a road any damn place I want. But she did not get it. So anyhow, you know they're out there, and you do have to make sure you get certain things right.
Well, maybe that's the origin to a wonderful line in Foregone is, the only way to know a landscape is to memorize it. So,
Well, I know.
well, we very much want to get to all of you, your questions. So they have a microphone here, but I think we're small enough that it's fine just sort of stand up, call out, whatever, but to make sure nobody, it doesn't look like a shy room, but in case anybody feels a little bit shy, I thought I'd get a little bit esoteric. And Bob, you might have a little envy after this that you didn't ask Joyce this today. So I looked at a book I'm very taken with called The Secret Language of Birthdays. The secret language of birthdays tells you, based on the day you were born, many things about you. So I look up March 28th, which is the day of innocence for you. And it says, in life, people like me born on this day have to go their own way, but may at times be blithely unaware of the direction they are taking. They display great concentration when doing their work. They often have a devoted and loyal following. There's a but. So here's the but. March 28th people are forever doubting their career choices and decisions. Did I really do the right thing is a question that often occurs to them. So looking back on these decades of writing absolutely amazingly fantastic novels, being a social pioneer, being brave, digging into race relations, class, you've done the right thing, I would say, yes?
You know, you can't ever know. I did what seemed to be then and now the only thing I could do. But about 15 years ago or so, I was offered my first honorary degree from the university. It's from St. Lawrence University up here in Canton. And I told my mother, I said, Mom, guess what? I'm getting an honorary degree. She said, what kind of degree is it, Russell? And I said, it's a PhD. She said, oh, Russell, you always did things the easy way. And then, you know, I laughed, and she looked at me, and then she realized how insane it was. And she laughed too, trying to get rid of it. But it was said and done, and it was one of those moments of great clarity for me with regard to my relation to my mother and her expectations as well.
So does anyone have a question?
I have a very specific sort of question, which is, I was curious, I haven't read this book yet, though I'm a huge fan of your work and I've written this whole, this is going to. Did you not begin this in a kind of fragmented story form in an anthology called It Occurs to Me That I Am American?
Yes, yes.
That's correct.
And also pieces of it, I was trying to get to that material in the book Voyager as well. Talking about they were more straightforwardly autobiographical. And I was more restricted in using of the material, but that's true. And so this has been lurking for some years. The themes that lay behind those earlier published excerpts and the book Voyager were lurking behind me until I could grasp a form, until I could invent a form that would allow me to turn it into what felt to me like a true narrative. I hadn't done that, I hadn't managed to do that. So you're right, the book has a history in that sense of attempts, failed attempts, to deal with certain difficult to plumb aspects of my own personal life.
Well, I don't think that's all failed attempt. I think it's quite beautiful, and I'm glad you expanded it.
Thank you.
Katie, I really enjoyed your book, The Darling. And I was wondering if you lived in Africa prior to Britain.
I didn't live there. I traveled there numerous times. First just by accident and curiosity. I went to Sierra Leone and then I went to Kenya and Tanzania and for other reasons. And then once I started writing about it, I was writing about Liberia, a West African state most particularly. And I had not been there at that time. But I was really trying to write about American revolutionaries of the late 60s, early 70s, what we were then calling, and still do to something we call terrorists, American white revolutionaries. And some of them did flee to Africa after, in the 70s, when the federal warrants for their arrest were on and so on. And so I felt the need, because of the Liberian Civil War in the late 80s and so on, crept into the narrative to go there. But you know, you do research for lots of different reasons, and I wasn't on a journalistic mission. What I was really trying to do was, in traveling there, I did travel there later, a few years after the Civil War, was to really find out what the fall of light is like, what does it smell like, the physical details of the place. The history is easy to get. You know, you can get it on the internet. You can get it in a library. You can read about it from other people's experiences, testimonies. But the physical details are very hard to get. The sensual quality of existence in this place is very hard to get without going there. And for the most part, in everything I've ever written, I have actually physically presented myself to that place in order to inhale the air and check the light and just experience it on a physical level. And so I did go to Africa, but I never lived there. No.
I've been there.
To Liberia?
No, to
East Africa.
and your book really grasps the whole field.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, Ellen?
So I have a question about the character of the nurse.
The darling? Oh, the nurse.
The nurse in Foregone. Wonderful character. And I know that I've heard another interview with you about Foregone where you talk about in that character that was sort of the purest love that you sort of depict in that book.
Yeah.
And I thought there was something, I wondered that because the nurse was taking care of someone who was clearly not able to take care of himself, did you feel that it was incredibly important to make her be sort of the one human, truly human person or kind person in that book?
Yeah, she's very important for lots of different reasons to me, and I hope in the book as well. She served a function as she's the only reliable, her point of view is the only reliable point of view in the novel. And how she sees them, how she sees the characters, whether it's Malcolm, the younger director, or the women, or Emma, the wife, or most importantly, Leo Fife, is really a useful way for us to
to triangulate ourselves towards these characters. If she thinks that when he's being sort of witty and wry and a little bit aggressive, that he's amusing, as she does on a couple of occasions, where it even begins that way. He says, the opening scene where he says to her, he says, "Tell me again why I agreed to this." And she's pushing his wheelchair into the room. She gets it. He's just, he's just being a little self-pitying and slightly hostile, not to her, but to the people he's about to deal with, and so on. And she gets it. And so she's a gateway, in a way, I hope, as like a Greek chorus almost for the reader's reality check. And you can use her, and I hope to do that with her throughout. But also in the course of the writing, I kind of fell in love with her. I just thought she was kind of a fascinating, interesting, profound person. The kind of person you would never quite recognize or see. The nurse, the black nurse with these white intellectuals, who is really kind of got a more realistic understanding of everything that's going on than they do. And so it's very important for me to begin with her and to end with her, as the novel does. It ends with her point of view, her perspective, even her most interior and subjective point of view as she leaves the scene. So it was fun. And she is the only person really in the novel who is custodian, who's a caretaker in an old-fashioned, unsentimental way. That's what she does, and she does it with competence and with compassion and without sentimentality. She's completely unsentimental in regard to Leo Fife's son.
I have a question that doesn't specifically refer to your writing, but just in general. Oftentimes when you look at the books that are selling well in this country, you see books by people who are never considered great writers, but who nevertheless sell a lot of books. And I'm talking about the Harlan Coben's and the Baldacci's and the people like that. The other one, Lee Child, who has the character Reacher, Jack Reacher. What do you think of these types of writers? Are they doing this purely for mercenary reasons, or does it fit under the general umbrella of literature in a sense?
Well, I don't know. I don't like to categorize, but I do know that storytelling takes many different, manifests itself very differently, and our needs for story are very different within the general population. Some of us get quickly bored with a certain kind of story and need something further or different than that. I have no particular hierarchy of value that I could place on in a general sense or a societal sense, let's say, with regard to pop fiction, any more than I do with film. I mean, some of them are like theme parks, and they really allow you to while away an afternoon and a day with your children or with your friends and have a great good time and a thrill riding the rides and whatever. And then there are those of us who will never go to a theme park, not because we feel condescending towards it or anything. It's just like not amusing, and it's boring to most of us, or to not most of us, but I mean to some of us. So I don't worry too much about it one way or the other. I don't think about it too much, except for the chunk of the publishing economy that goes toward it. On the other hand, they pay the way for most of the rest of us, so why not? Stephen King is I happen to think, a really terrific writer who writes books that are extremely popular, and there are others like that who cross over. And so I'm kind of interested in how that happens. It's just not something I can do myself or do I much read. But I don't know, I think these are kind of useless distinctions in the end, to make these kinds of cultural distinctions between what's popular culture on the one hand and what's literary culture, books, serious culture on the other. It's all ours, and
we can embrace whatever little aspects of it that attract us and glitter for us, and leave us moved and changed in some deep way. And we're all changed differently and by different sources. And so I try not to distinguish between them in an hierarchical way.
Also, it's so interesting to me when I hear you and other authors talk about your own characters of your own creation. It seems like as it goes on, they become sort of separate and distinct from you.
They become what?
They take on a life of their own,
Yeah.
and it becomes almost separate from you, and something you almost have no control over. It's just so interesting to me. If you could talk a little bit about how, as you kind of give birth to a character, but then it becomes something almost beyond you, the one who actually created it. Like when Elena was asking about a character, do you forgive them? Or you said, I sort of fell in love with that character. But you invented them, but it's almost like they've become something beyond you.
Yeah. It must be interesting to somebody who's a psychiatrist, psychologist, has training, huh? What's this phenomenon going on here? It's beyond projection. Yeah, you feel sometimes like Geppetto, who made Pinocchio, a little wooden doll, who became a boy.
There's also a character in Foregone.
Yes, exactly. And you feel like you start out just carving a piece of wood and a few sticks and tying them together with strings. And, 'cause that's how it begins, this rudimentary way. And then at a certain point, the boy kind of stands up and he says, whoa, what's going on here? And then he starts to talk to you, and you hear his voice. And then he starts to create relationships with other people in your household. And so, it takes over. But it is a little like that magic, and that's one of my favorite stories in my life. Is the story of the bad boy, too. That may be part of it. But I just love the act of creation that's implied by that story. And it isn't, the Joy speak for her, but I think it is, I've heard her speak before about how it is for her too, because they do take on a life. And it's not, it's not psychotic. It's not, it's the power of the imagination to lead you out of yourself into the life of yes, it's an invented character, invented reality, but it is no less real if you are attentive to it to the degree that you have to be in order to write it all, and live with it as closely and intimately as you have to in order to write it all. I keep on bringing it back to the process. It's the process that makes this possible. It's not the craft of fiction that makes it possible. It's not a writer's workshop that makes it possible. It's the overall complete process of dedicating your life to this kind of mental activity, which then produces a reality that allows you to take the deepest, most subjective experiences in your own life, those that you're barely conscious of, and project them into the interior subjective life of somebody else, a stranger, someone you will never meet, possibly doesn't even speak your language, and his or her life as well. It's an extraordinary kind of human activity when you think about it.
Yes, so you've written so sympathetically of true believers and fanatics like John Brown and also failed revolutionaries. So I wonder if you're developing those things in your next novel. I've heard interesting things about your next novel. You might tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. I had two projects. COVID's been very, very good to me in terms of writing. It just removed all distractions from my life in a way, and I managed to after I finished Foregone, I managed to then quickly finish another longer novel. This is, I think, set in the northern part of the Everglades in South Florida in the late 19th, early 20th century. I found in that history, the Everglades have long fascinated me, and I have a home, an apartment in South Beach, in Miami, and I spent a lot of time there, and I have for most of my adult life. And the Everglades particularly have fascinated me. And I found a paragraph in a history of the Everglades that referenced a Shaker colony established in the Everglades in the 1890s, an offshoot from one right here in Lebanon in New York, over near Albany, and it lasted until the 1920s, early 20s. And so I just was drawn into this. What the hell were the Shakers doing in the Everglades? And it just fascinated me. But that led me into a deeper understanding and thinking, deeper curious thinking about the whole utopian fantasy that lies behind the American dream. And its odd, conflicted relationship to the fantasy about land and speculation of land and sales of land, which lies also behind the American dream, the conflict between these two, utopianism and land ownership speculation, which come together in Florida for me, and especially and it happened in the Everglades. The reason the Shakers were there was because in the late 19th century, the federal and state government, and state government of Florida opened up vast tract of Florida, the way they opened up Oklahoma a little earlier, to quick sales. You could go in there and you could buy land in vast amounts for very, very little money, almost $1 an acre. So the Shakers, who were no dummies, bought 7,000 acres of swampland. They were also really good at drainage. They could take 7,000 acres of swampland and in a few years turn it into really productive, fertile, dark, black soil that would grow everything. And in very short order, they were selling pineapples to Cuba, and they were sending oranges and grapefruit and berries to upstate New York. And in the winter months, they thrived in this. So the combination of the two was just irresistible to me. It was utopianism on the one hand, because the Shakers were communists, feminists, abolitionists, utopianism. And the only thing that differed from most of the other utopian groups was that they were celibate. So they had a built-in life expectancy. They couldn't reproduce themselves. And they relied heavily on bringing in, for new membership, orphans and abandoned children and abandoned, mostly the young men who were pregnant. So, later, late 20th, late 19th, early 20th century, social programs began to pick up that slack, as it were, and so they couldn't much recruit.
What's the title of this one? What's the title of this new book?
Well, this is another interesting aspect of this land, this 7,000 acres. As I got into it, I realized, wait a minute, this is land that was bought up by Disney in 1956 to 1961, and it eventually became a part of Disney World, which is another utopian capitalist fantasy. And so it's called the Magic Kingdom. So there's that. And I finished that book and then turned it in. And then I got really busy and I've written down 3 novellas. And I go to the third for the next book. For the first time in my life, I'm 2 books ahead of publication. I've never been even 1 book ahead of publication before. And the 3 novellas are taken together. They're written all up, set all up here in the North Country, and they're interrelated. There's stories about people who quite consciously and deliberately voted for Donald Trump. And they're all, I think, sympathetic. And so it's a real test for me writing these stories as to how can I write about people with whom I so deeply disagree. write with sympathy for them. I do make a distinction, to go back to your question this afternoon, Bob, between sympathy and empathy. And for me, sympathy is much more important. To feel with rather than to feel for. And I feel with these people, try to see. That's so I finished these 2 books now. And I've got a little work to do.
Anyone else? Well, I think that's really the very best news I can imagine. The idea that there are 3 new Russell Banks books to go out and take up. For those of us especially who are still feeling in pandemic mode, like that makes for very great news. I want to thank you all very much for coming. And Russell, I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Yeah.